Valuing ourselves rightly. No one speaks about the topic of Black people and loving without addressing issues of low self esteem and self hatred. It is by now common knowledge that the trauma of white supremacy and ongoing racist assault leaves deep psychic wounds. Whether the issue is a painful color caste system in Black life or violent action used by whites against Blacks, denigrating speech, physical aggression, or dehumanizing representation, every day all Black people encounter, as does everyone else, some expression of hatred toward Blackness, whether we recognize it or not. Prone to recognize overt expressions of hating Blackness, everyone tends to ignore constant covert expressions. A denigrating remark by a seemingly friendly person, a stereotypically racist representation in a magazine or on a billboard, or the myriad of times that in any given day when a white person takes a public transportation and stands rather than sit next to a black person, but sits if a seat opens up next to someone white. In predominantly black environments, someone may be casually using the word nigger or jokingly talking about black folks as lazy and not wanting to work. All these incidents are expressions of white supremacist thinking and action in daily life and the hatred of blackness that it condones and perpetuates. White supremacy is a much more useful term than racism because it allows us both to hold non black folks accountable for actions of covert and overt racial aggression and to look at and challenge the ways black people internalize white supremacist thought and action. Tragically, most black folks first experience racist wounding in our own homes when our worth is judged at birth by the color of our skin or by the texture of our hair. Prior to militant movements for Black Power, which challenged the denigration of Black bodies using the in your face slogan, Black is beautiful, a large majority of Black people simply accepted the notion of aesthetic inferiority in relation to whiteness. From the outset of our history in the United States, Black folks aggressively challenged the notion that we were in any way intellectually inferior to white people. Consistently, Black folks and our white allies in struggle called attention to Black intellectual and artistic genius to resist racist stereotypes. White supremacists' insistence that Black people were lazy and unwilling to work hard was not internalized by Black folks because their experiential knowledge countered this assumption. Every day we saw Black folks working from sunup to sundown, sometimes working themselves to death. Even in the face of racism's most vicious institution, slavery, initially on all fronts, enslaved Black folks refused to embrace white notions of our inferiority. But that changed when white racists doled out privileges and rewards based on skin color. As this happened, it not only divided Black folks from one another, creating a level of mistrust and suspicion that had not been there when all Black folks were similar in skin color, it also laid the foundation for assimilation. White supremacist practices of breeding through rape of Black women by white masters produced mixed race offspring whose skin color and facial features were often radically different from the Black norm. This led to the formation of a color caste aesthetic. While white racists had never deemed Black people beautiful before, they had a higher aesthetic regard for racially mixed Black folks. When that regard took the form of granting privileges and rewards on the basis of skin color, Black people began to internalize similar aesthetic values. To understand the color class system and its impact on Black life, we have to acknowledge the link between patriarchal abuse of Black women's bodies and the overvaluation of fair skin. White supremacist formation of a color caste system where lighter skin was valued more than dark skin was the handiwork of white male patriarchs. Combining racist and sexist attitudes, individual white men showed favor toward the lighter skinned breed of Black folks that came into being as a result of their sexual assault of Black women's bodies. While white men use the bodies of darker skinned black women as vessels to act out violent sexual lusts without developing emotional bonds and ties, their biological ties to mixed race black people led to the development of different and diverse sentiments. Whereas racist, sexist iconography had deemed the darker skinned black woman ugly and monstrous, a new standard of evaluation came into being to judge the value of fair skinned females. Aesthetic eroticization of the lighter eroticization of lighter skinned black female gave her higher status than the darker females, creating a sordid context for competition and envy that extended far beyond slavery. How sad it must have been for enslaved black females to find themselves pitted against one another for small favors. Just as the dehumanization via objectification of enslaved black women's bodies was spearheaded by patriarchal white males, enslaved black males who embraced patriarchal thinking, no doubt the notion that women were inferior to men was already ingrained in their psyche before coming to the so-called New World. As women were subordinated to men in most archaic societies globally, they began to value lighter skinned women over darker counterparts. Annals of history show that lighter skinned black male was often viewed with suspicion. He was seen as a threat to white male power. The lighter skinned female was seen as more likely to affirm and uphold patriarchal white male power. As the object of a white male's desire, she was perceived as a creature the white male could subjugate at will. As a strategy of colonization, encouraging enslaved blacks to embrace and uphold white supremacist aesthetic was a masterstroke. Teaching black folks to hate dark skin was one way to ensure that whether white oppressors were present or not, the values of white supremacy would still rule the day. Prominent patriarchal black male leaders who resisted racism on every other front showed a preference for light skinned women. By their actions, they made the color caste system acceptable. From slavery to the present day, dark skinned children in black families risk not being as highly valued as lighter counterparts. In my lifetime, in the 60s, Black Power movement was the only time that the color caste system was militantly challenged. While the slogan, Black is Beautiful, does not seem at all revolutionary today, before radical change, in racial hierarchies, it was taboo to publicly voice militant resistance to Black supremacy by denouncing color caste. The 60s and early 70s were the time when Black folks working in the mental health field first began to directly speak about the way in which masses of Black people had internalized racist assumptions about the ugliness of our bodies. The interventions created by civil rights struggle and the militant Black resistance to white supremacy effectively raised consciousness and helped many Black folks to divest themselves of white supremacist thinking. However, just as enslaved and newly freed Black male leaders showed distinct preferences for fair skin, the leaders of our militant revolution did the same. They preached love of Blackness, even as they continued to give preferential treatment to those females who were lighter or, in some cases, white. In the 60s, Malcolm X's decision to marry a darker skinned sister, one chosen for him by his mentor and leader, Elijah Muhammad, was meant to set an example to other Black men. Undoubtedly, male preference for fair skinned partners led Black mothers to feel that birthing fair skinned children, especially if they were female, would heighten their chances of surviving and becoming a success. Heterosexual Black males' lust for fair skinned mates created a climate of hostile competition between Black females of all skin colors. The negative impact of color caste systems has been most felt by children. Whether they are dark or fair, Black children have been subjected to a level of shaming that is psychologically traumatic. Children degrade each other on the basis of skin color because they learn from adults that this is acceptable. Whether it be a light skinned child lording it over a darker peer, or a group of dark skinned children mocking and ridiculing a fair skinned peer, the intended outcome, to make that person ashamed of their physical features, is the same. It wounds the child's spirit, no matter their skin color. Collectively, Black folks already know what must change if we are to completely eradicate color caste systems. Many of those changes, the praising of diverse skin colors, the choice of variously hued black images in visual media, the refusal to equate dark skin with evil, and so on, which were put into place by militant civil rights struggles, were undermined by unspoken backlash spearheaded by the white dominant mass media. As we saw more images of black people on television and in movies, color casts overdetermined the nature of their roles. Dark skinned people were usually cast in negative roles. They were the bad guys or the bad women, whores and prostitutes. The good people were always lighter. Black filmmaker Spike Lee brought national attention to the problem of color cast with his movie School Days. But the movie simply reproduced the skin color hierarchy. It did not challenge it or offer a new vision. More often than not, Black controlled mass media have been as invested in the color cast system as the dominant white culture. No matter the color of a filmmaker's skin, in movies and videos today, darker skinned Black women are not likely to be cast in any role except that of a demonic Black bitch. In Scary Movie, a film made by Black filmmakers, the Black female character is depicted as hateful. Ultimately, she's brutally murdered by a group of white folk. Indeed, media fixation on mixed race beauty has led to the institutionalization in mass media of a color caste system to the one that reigned supreme in Jim Crow years of racial apartheid. Passive acceptance of internalized racism intensified with legal racial integration and the co-commitment demand that Black people who want to succeed assimilate the values and beliefs of the dominant white culture. As beloved Black male leaders were assassinated, our militant movement to end white supremacy ended. Changes came: equal access to education, more and more better job opportunities, and with them the assumption that Black people had no longer needed to engage in militant protests. By the end of the 70s, Black people were ready to sit back, relax, and live the American dream like everyone else. There was no longer an organized, radical, anti racist movement to monitor whether or not all the changes were having positive impact on Black life. On the one hand, one of the more serious changes, radical integration of public schools, gave Black children equal access to the same levels of information offered white children who attended these institutions. But on the other hand, it meant that we are now being taught for the most part by unenlightened white teachers with biased perspectives. Usually, racist biases inform the knowledge Black children received. And on a more concrete level, the personal politics of white supremacy could be reenacted. The most rewarded Black children were often those who were more docile and subordinate. The fairer they were, the more likely they were to be treated by teachers as capable of performing well. In my segregated grade school and junior high school, no Black child was made to feel that allegiance to the race was determined by not liking to do one's work. If you played violin, studied French, or loved physics, no one can taunt you that these passions were expressing a desire to be white, as everyone was Black, including our teachers. That changed with racial integration. In the predominantly white high school, one of my most attentive, caring white teachers also told me repeatedly that I would never have a Black male partner because I was smart. There were no Black males in gifted classes in these schools. Their absence was not because they were not smart. It was indicative of the desire of white races to keep Black males away from contact with white females. Other Black children were told at home that they needed to uplift the race by studying hard and proving their worth. Not wanting to worry and upset parents, Black children of all classes usually did not share the various racist assaults they encountered in schools. Racial integration soon became a space where heightened levels of racial humiliation and shaming took place. Shame makes self acceptance and self love impossible. Ironically, as more and more Black people benefited economically from the changes brought about as a result of the civil rights struggle, the efforts to transform our culture in ways that would both eliminate white supremacist thinking and offer healing paradigms slackened. Most Black thinkers acknowledge that internalized self hatred is more pronounced now than it was when the economic circumstances of Black people were far worse. When there was no social and racial integration, too late, Progressive Black people and our allies in struggle learned that legalized racial integration would not change white supremacist perspectives. Since anti racist individuals did not control mass media, the media became the primary tool that will be used and is still used to convince Black viewers and everyone else of Black inferiority. A pedagogy of racial hatred comes to us every day by way of mass media. The images we see of Black people are more often than not degrading and dehumanizing. Without an organized anti racist political movement to diligently challenge media distortions, they rule the day. No one raises a fuss when the one Black child in the television commercial is placed in a stereotypical role. No one urges mass boycott of films portraying Black males as brutal rapists and murderers. No one acts as though the Black actors who eagerly take roles that depict Black people as being irrational, immoral, and lacking in basic intelligence are perpetuating white supremacy. Yet these images are not Yet these images not only teach Black folks and everybody else, especially young children who lack critical skills, that Black people are hateful and unworthy of love. They teach white folks to fear Black aggression. This fear allows white folks to feel justified when they treat Black people in dehumanizing ways in daily life. A white woman who clutches her purse as she walks toward a young Black male or female on the street sends a message not only that she fears for her safety, but that all Black people, that she sees all Black people as potential criminals. We live in a society where we are daily confronting negative images of Blackness. It takes courage and vigilance to create a context where self love can emerge. When I recognized that Black folks who were collectively losing ground, when I recognized that Black folks were collectively losing ground when it came to the practice of self love, in a collection of essays, Black Looks, Race and Representation, I advocated that we renew anti racist struggle in ways that would focus on loving Blackness. In an essay titled Loving Blackness and Political Resistance, I call to attention the reality that to end white supremacy, we must create the conditions not only for Black people to love Blackness, but for everyone else to love Blackness. All Black folks who love Blackness recognize that it is not enough for us to be decolonized, that the non Black folks we work with, who teach our children and so on, need consciousness raising that will enable them to see Blackness differently. I concluded this essay by stating, collectively, Black people and our allies in struggle are empowered when we practice self love as a revolutionary intervention that undermines practices of domination. Loving Blackness as a political resistance transforms our ways of looking and being, and thus creates the conditions necessary for us to move against the forces of domination and death and reclaim Black life. Loving Blackness is more important than gaining access to material privilege. We know that many successful Black people have assimilated white supremacist thinking and feel themselves and other Black people to be unworthy, even though they may live and act as though they are the exception to the rule. The issue of loving Blackness goes beyond the question of race. Focus on racist assaults on Black self esteem has often caused us to ignore the impact of class. Even though we know that masses of Black people are poor, they have not linked the perpetuation of low self esteem among non privileged groups to the way all poor people are looked down upon in the society and treated accordingly. When an overwhelming majority of Black people were poor because racial segregation denied us access to jobs and economic advancement, in our communities, poverty was not a source of shame. Indeed, families often approach lack from a global perspective, relating their experience of material lack to that of folks in other countries. Since religion taught us that God loved the poor and the oppressed, we understood that to live simply, whether one had freely chosen that or not, was to live in harmony with divine will. In the past, by not attaching negative stigmas to material lack, Black people effectively refused to allow material status to determine substantive value. In our churches, we were constantly taught that being rich was not a virtue, that it was more virtuous to love one's neighbor and to share resources, that greed was a sin. As the church started to become a site of class mobility, as churches evolved from places of worship to corporations, institutions requiring more money. These values were no longer emphasized. When this reality was coupled with a turning away from religious teachings as a practical guide for one's life, Black folks of all classes began to buy into capitalist consumer thinking, which equated worth to material status and spread the message that you are what you buy. The mass media, which had for the most part ignored the poor, showing us mostly the fictional lifestyles of the rich, began to tell everyone that to be poor was to be nothing. More than racial assault, which Black folks were quick to recognize and resist, this type of thinking was demoralizing. It was also terribly dangerous. It helped create a social climate in poor and destitute Black communities where individuals were willing to rob, beat, and kill one another for material items. It helped lay the groundwork for acceptance of a drug-based, capitalist, dog-eat-dog culture in poor communities, where non-Black market values like sharing resources and neighborliness, which were once the norm, have become ridiculed, mocked, and all but erased. It also led to the groundwork for unprecedented levels of petty envy and hostility in communities where Black folks had once been bonded by respect for shared circumstance rooted in hardship. Usually, folks blame drugs for the moral breakdown in poor communities, but drugs, hard and soft, has always been present in Black life. The social context in which they were once used was one that emphasized pleasure, not escape from dehumanization and pain. When poor and destitute people of any race were made to feel that they really had no right to exist because they lacked the material goods that give life meaning, it is this it is this immoral climate that sets the stage for widespread addiction. In recent years, when poverty has been depicted as a crime against humanity, poor people of all races have been seen as criminals and treated accordingly. This demoralization shames. It creates depression, despair, and dangerous life threatening nihilism Black leaders talk about. It lays the emotional groundwork for widespread addiction. Addiction is not about relatedness, hence, it destroys community. It creates a predatory culture, one where individuals regard each other with fear and loathing. In Black families where addiction to drugs like heroin, cocaine, and crack prevail, bonds of affection and care are daily destroyed. Addiction knows no class. While materially privileged people are able to deny and cover up the negative impact of substance abuse on their family life, emotional devastation is more readily visible in the lives of the poor and underclass. We know drug addicted parents of all classes often neglect and abuse children, at times making them the object of profound, brutal rage. There are few places where this woundedness is attended to, where this post traumatic stress individuals endure is addressed in a healing therapeutic environment. Such environments would not solve the problem of poverty, but they would address the underlying issues of self esteem and self love. One can be poor and still be self loving. A huge majority of successful Black people who came from poor and or working class backgrounds know the truth. Just as a material privilege will not ensure that any of us will be self loving, poverty does not create low self esteem and self hatred. Until Black people of all classes are willing to challenge negative attitudes towards the poor, greed will continue to be forced. Greed will continue to be the force that ravages all our diverse communities. Greed is sanctioned by those at the top of our class hierarchies and trickles down. The rich who condone exploitation, murder, and slavery in order to maintain their wealth are no different from the poor who prey on one another in order to satisfy material longings. Greed manufactures hate. Without challenging the politics of materialist greed, we cannot create the climate in Black life that will allow us to embrace non market values. From experience, Black people know that no matter what our economic circumstance, we can create an environment that is permeated by a love ethic. Those of us who come from a non privileged background know this by heart because we felt the love in those places where material plenty was lacking. Love is especially available to us because it is a non market value. We can create love wherever we are. Valuing ourselves rightly means we understand love to be the only foundation of being that will sustain us in both times of lack and times of plenty.